Picture this. February 12, 1945. The clock reads 4:47 p.m. Somewhere in the forested terrain outside Epernay, France, a young American soldier presses himself into the frozen ground. Jack Bingham, just 22 years old, serves as a sniper in the 2nd Battalion, 3rd Infantry Regiment, 4th Infantry Division of the U.S. Army. Around him, the winter atmosphere carries the sharp smell of gunpowder mixed with wet evergreens. Cradled in his grip sits a Springfield M1903A4 rifle, standard military hardware for American snipers during the war. But there's something different about this particular weapon. The optical sight attached to it isn't government-issued. It's something Jack created with his own 2 hands. When his comrades first spotted it, they couldn't hold back their amusement. An improvised scope constructed from the remains of a medical microscope, a steel component salvaged from a destroyed German artillery shell serving as the mounting ring, hand-carved markings instead of factory calibrations. The whole thing looked ridiculous, like a child's science project. They nicknamed it his toy. They told Jack he was living in a fantasy. Several warned that his homemade contraption would be the death of him if he tried playing inventor in a combat zone. Then, just 27 seconds into the future, those same soldiers witnessed something that silenced every doubt. A German Panzer IV tank, positioned over 200 yards distant, roughly 100 meters, suddenly burst into a violent inferno. The blast reverberated across the landscape. This wasn't an artillery barrage. No planes had swooped down from above. This was the work of a single individual, a single round, and a single handcrafted optical device. The laughter died instantly. What you're about to hear is the authentic, almost impossible tale of Jack "Red" Bingham, the American infantryman, who became a target of mockery for designing his own rifle scope until the instant he deployed it to alter the outcome of an engagement. This is about skepticism, creativity under pressure, and the single extraordinary shot that carved itself into military history. When the 4th Infantry Division of the United States Army found itself battling through the final German counteroffensive, the Battle of the Bulge, during the brutal winter of 1944, every man was pushed to his limits, frozen, drained, and slowly advancing toward the east. As February 1945 arrived, the fighting had shifted into northeastern France, specifically the Champagne-Ardenne territory. In the forested hills and valleys surrounding Epernay, the 2nd Battalion of the 3rd Infantry Regiment, designated simply as 2 to 3, received a challenging assignment: probe enemy fortifications and create weaknesses in German defensive positions dug in beyond the Bois de la Lane ridge. Jack Bingham stood among these soldiers. His hometown was Marshall, Kansas, a rural farming community housing barely 10,000 residents. Before military service found him, Jack had never squeezed a trigger in actual combat. His civilian trade was mechanics, but his true nature was that of a problem solver. At 19, he'd worked alongside his uncle in a watch repair business. He possessed the ability to reconstruct timepieces without even looking, his steady fingers manipulating tiny gears with such exactness that elderly clients would joke, "That boy's got ice water in his veins." When the draft claimed Jack in spring 1943, these very abilities caught attention at Fort Benning. Throughout rifle qualification courses, he amazed his trainers not merely through accurate shooting, but through his analytical approach. He compensated for wind and bullet drop instinctively, never waiting for instruction. He calculated ranges mentally, using natural landmarks, trees, fence lines, even the angle of shadows. Yet with no established sniper curriculum available and optical sights in short supply, Jack received assignment as an ordinary rifleman. Following the conclusion of the Battle of the Bulge in January 1945, Army leadership began acknowledging a critical shortage of trained marksmen. Numerous scopes, models like the Weaver 330C, had been damaged, rendered useless by moisture or simply disappeared. Supply lines struggled to keep pace. In Battalion 2 to 3, only 3 scoped rifles existed for hundreds of men. Jack recognized this gap as his opening. Early February found him stationed near Epernette, where he quietly requested access to the battalion field hospital. There he retrieved a damaged microscope, an American-manufactured Bulge and Lum model that had cracked during transportation. He extracted the lens assembly and converted it into a makeshift aiming device. For the mounting system, he repurposed a steel ring scavenged from a blown-apart German 18mm artillery shell. Across 2 consecutive nights, he soldered, shaped, and carefully balanced his creation onto the barrel of his standard-issue Springfield M1903A4. The moment he revealed it to his squad, mockery erupted immediately. "That contraption looks like it escaped from a high school lab," someone remarked. "Hey Bingham, you planning to study bacteria or shoot Germans?" Another voice chimed in. Even his platoon sergeant waved it off dismissively. "That's not regulation equipment. Don't come whining to me when it falls apart after your first trigger pull." Jack remained unfazed. He trusted the tool because he'd built it himself from scratch. He'd conducted range tests in the woodlands west of their position, tracking consistency and measuring accuracy. The scope wasn't flawless. The image carried a bluish tint, the lens surface scratched too easily, and the 0 point shifted with temperature fluctuations. But it functioned. It magnified targets, it held alignment, and critically it was the only scope he could actually use. He wasn't chasing heroism, he simply wanted to contribute effectively. Within the rigid structure of the 1945 American military, innovation typically flowed from headquarters downward. Jack Bingham was about to flip that assumption completely, demonstrating that sometimes during warfare, the most crucial breakthroughs emerge not from research facilities or production lines, but from mud-covered trenches under enemy fire, in the hands of a quiet young man who refuses to accept that standard issue means only option. Jack Bingham never submitted paperwork to build his scope. He understood that wouldn't work. In military culture, improvisation wasn't celebrated unless it originated from high-ranking officers. What he did request, quietly and respectfully, was time. Time after dark, time in solitude, time to construct something superior to the nothing he'd been provided. Throughout those early February nights in 1945, Jack worked beneath canvas sheeting just beyond the tree line west of Epernette. He wrapped his equipment in burlap and oilcloth to dampen the sound of metal tools striking together. His flashlight received a covering of red cellophane, stolen from a medic's signal kit. He maintained notes in a pocket-sized ledger, recording distance calculations, crosswind deflection, and thermal adjustment factors. His process was methodical, borderline obsessive, intensely concentrated. He broke the microscope tube into its 3 primary components: the objective lens, the focusing ring, and the eyepiece. Then he affixed the entire system to the Springfield's receiver using 2 custom-fabricated rings secured with salvaged bolts. The vertical crosshair, essentially his aiming point, was hand-drawn using a single strand of wire extracted from a field telephone cable, stretched across a ring and sealed with dental cement. It wasn't beautiful, but precision was there. Every evening following dusk, Jack traveled to an open area they called Red Hill, named not for bloodshed, but for the iron-rich earth. There he conducted his practice sessions. He positioned rusted helmets atop fence posts at varying distances, initially 200 yards, then expanding to 400, then 600. Each night he stepped farther backward. He recorded data, calculated bullet drop angles, monitored how the improvised lens performed in frigid conditions. The scope developed slight fog in freezing temperatures, but he discovered a workaround, coating the interior glass with a thin soap film, then buffing it clean. It worked adequately. Jack rarely conversed with others during these training sessions. They knew his routine. Some observed from afar, entertained by the spectacle. Others paid him no mind. His platoon sergeant issued one stern warning: "You're burning ammunition we can't spare." Jack responded only once: "Sir, I'll make every round count." By February 10th, Division intelligence confirmed increased German armored activity near the Bois de la Lane, particularly vehicles identified as Panzerkampfwagen I4. These tanks, commonly abbreviated to Panzer IV, had served as Germany's armored backbone throughout most of the war. The variant frequently spotted in that sector was the Ausführung H model, equipped with 75mm high-velocity cannons and frontal armor plates measuring up to 80mm thick. For foot soldiers caught exposed by a panzer, survival was unlikely. The conventional solutions involved air support, anti-tank artillery, or bazooka teams firing from dangerously close range. A rifle, even a precision rifle, had no business engaging one. But Jack wasn't planning to penetrate armor plating. He'd studied Panzer IV schematics carefully. He understood the layout intimately. He knew the engine compartment at the rear housed fuel intake caps, frequently left unsealed during hasty refueling operations. He'd witnessed multiple times spare fuel canisters strapped to the back of German armored columns, standard operating procedure for extended operations. Easy to reach for the crew, but also completely unprotected. If he could target that specific point, not the hull, not the turret, but a vulnerable, exposed element, he might not destroy the tank through direct damage, but he could ignite it, force it to halt operations, drive the crew to evacuate, generate chaos. That would be sufficient. His strategy wasn't reckless. It was calculated down to the last detail, but nobody believed in it yet. By February 11th, 1945, the 2nd Battalion of the 3rd Infantry Regiment had pushed forward to the edges of the Bois de la Lane, ATT, forested patch overlooking a shallow valley near the Marne River. The 4th Infantry Division had received orders to breach German defensive lines, neutralize remaining resistance pockets, and capture elevated terrain for the upcoming spring offensive into German territory proper. But something felt wrong. Reconnaissance teams reported heightened armor movement along a dirt road winding through the forest. It was narrow, muddy, and essentially invisible from aerial observation, perfect for moving tanks without attracting attention. Intelligence verified it. At minimum, 3 Panzer IV tanks were entrenched along the forest's western perimeter, rotating shifts every 6 hours. The Germans were digging in for a stand. That morning, during a tactical briefing, Lieutenant Colonel Harris turned toward his platoon commanders and made an unconventional request. He wanted a marksman in position by dawn the following morning, someone quiet, steady, and familiar with the local terrain. The objective was straightforward but risky: observe enemy movements and, if opportunity presented itself, disrupt German vehicle operations without engaging infantry directly. Create confusion, eliminate officers, force operational delays. One name surfaced: Bingham. Jack received a summons to the command tent, where Harris examined him like inspecting a questionable piece of equipment. "I hear you've been playing mad scientist with a rifle," Harris stated. "Yes, sir. You think that contraption of yours can hit anything beyond 400 yards? "I know it can, sir." Harris didn't nod. He didn't smile. He simply handed Jack a tactical map and circled a location marked Grid 17 Alpha, an elevated thicket of pine trees approximately 200 yards from suspected German tank positions. Clear line of sight, but an extreme distance, longer than regulation standards, longer than tactical doctrine recommended. You'll insert before dawn. No support element, no noise, no second opportunities. Yes, sir. That night Jack packed minimally. His Springfield rifle with the homemade scope, 40 rounds of match-grade ammunition, each individually selected for consistency. Wire cutters, 2 canteens, 1 chocolate bar, no sidearm. He didn't anticipate fighting his way out if things went wrong. As sunset arrived, he departed alone, cutting through frost-covered terrain toward Grid 17 Alpha. He reached the ridge shortly past midnight and excavated a shallow depression beneath a fallen pine. Above him, moonlight filtered through thin cloud coverage, casting long silver shadows across the treetops. The night was deathly still, no insects, no breeze, just the distant percussion of artillery and occasional bark of a German machine gun far eastward. Jack adjusted his scope. He marked notches on a branch overhead to track shifting wind patterns. He measured distance using fence posts and valley floor width. He double-checked mounting ring tension. Everything was tight, properly aligned. He remained prone, completely motionless for nearly 6 hours. Just before dawn broke, a column of smoke materialized on the horizon. The Panzer was approaching, slow, deliberate. It emerged from the trees and paused just beyond the ridgeline. Steam hissed from exhaust pipes. A crew member, bareheaded, likely the loader, stepped outside and began refueling from an external jerry can strapped to the rear hull. It was precisely what Jack had been waiting for. One mistake, one exposed canister, one chance. He exhaled slowly, 200 yards, a target no larger than a lunchbox. Less than 3 seconds of visibility window. He steadied the crosshairs. His finger moved to the trigger. The world fell silent. 200 yards, 100 meters, nearly 3/4 of a mile, across a muddy French valley, cloaked in early morning fog. No spotter providing range confirmation. No support team. No guarantee whatsoever. Just one man, one rifle, and one improvised optical sight. Jack Bingham steadied his breathing. His body remained still, but his thoughts raced. He could see the tank now, clearly framed in the cold morning light. A German Panzer IV Ausführung H, heavy with accumulated mud and frost. Its 75mm cannon angled slightly downward as it idled in position. Behind it, 2 crew members conducted refueling from a canister strapped to the rear hull. They moved quickly, assuming they operated safely. The American front line was over a kilometer distant. No one would dare attempt a shot from that range. Jack's eyes narrowed. He wasn't aiming for the tank's turret or hull. That would be futile. The Panzer's armor plating, 80mm thick at the front, was more than adequate to deflect a rifle round. Even from a high-powered .30 caliber Springfield, the bullet would flatten like a pressed coin. But Jack wasn't attempting to punch through steel. He was targeting something soft, something combustible. He'd researched this thoroughly. German refueling procedures were often rushed, especially under operational pressure. If the crew left the cap loose or spilled even a few ounces of fuel near the intake, it could ignite. And if flames reached the ammunition stored near the engine bay, then even a single rifle round could trigger something. Catastrophic. He aligned the reticle, hand-painted. Wire stretched across his view like a luminous cross. The wind had calmed to almost nothing. Just a light breeze from the west, perhaps 3 miles per hour. He adjusted for drift. 1/4 inch left at the muzzle would translate to several feet off target at that distance. He inhaled once, held it, and squeezed. The recoil kicked gently against his shoulder. The shot's report cracked across the valley, and for a moment, just a brief moment, nothing happened. Then it did. A spark, a hiss, a bloom of orange flame. The jerrycan exploded first, showering the crew with burning fuel. One of them screamed. The second attempted to run. Flames climbed up the tank's rear, catching on the engine grate, then crawling inward. And then, with a sound like thunder compressed inside a metal container, the ammunition inside the Panzer cooked off. The tank detonated from the rear, a fireball punching upward into the pine-scraped sky. Bingham never moved. His finger slid off the trigger. He watched as smoke billowed into the morning light, as chaos erupted among nearby German troops who scrambled to comprehend what had just occurred. Some pointed frantically. Others dove for cover. No one could locate the shot's origin. It was too far, too precise. Back on the American side, soldiers from 2 to 3 watched in stunned silence. They'd heard the single shot, then witnessed the fire, then the explosion. At first, no one spoke. Then a corporal muttered, "No way. That wasn't Bingham, was it?" Another replied, "He's the only one out there." By the time Jack crawled back into the tree line, hours later, his hands were raw from the cold. His face was speckled with dirt. He looked exhausted, and when he returned to the forward operating post, no one laughed, no one scoffed. They looked at the rifle, then the scope, then him. No medals were handed out. No ceremony occurred, just quiet awe. Jack Bingham had just executed the impossible shot with a rifle no one trusted and a scope no one believed in. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. When Jack Bingham returned to base that afternoon, the war surrounding him hadn't changed. But something else had shifted dramatically. The way people regarded him, the tone in their voices, the silence that replaced the usual sarcasm. The man they'd once called Scope Boy or Optics Jack now walked among them with quiet gravity, not because he'd demanded respect, but because he'd earned it through action. The story spread rapidly. Within hours, Lieutenant Colonel Harris received a message from battalion headquarters. German radio intercepts had noted a suspected American sniper attack on an armored unit. The panzer that had erupted in flames, serial number unknown, had been part of a mobile counterattack force intended to halt the 4th Infantry's eastward advance. It never got the chance. Jack's shot had crippled that movement, and in doing so created a ripple effect. German tank crews began altering procedures. Fuel canisters were now stored farther from the rear deck. Refueling operations were delayed until vehicles were under cover. Hatches remained closed unless absolutely necessary. That kind of adjustment didn't stem from a rumor. It came from fear. The command staff at 2 to 3 summoned Jack for a debrief the following morning. The officers wanted every detail. His process, his calculations, his scope. He brought it in, the handmade optic now slightly blackened from residue and frost. He explained how he'd utilized a broken Bausch and Lumb microscope, how he'd calibrated it using scratch marks and trial and error, and how he'd painted his reticle from a single wire strand taken from a communications cable. They took notes, real notes. For the first time, people listened attentively. Lieutenant Colonel Harris leaned forward and asked directly, "Could you teach this?" Jack didn't hesitate. "Yes, sir." The following week, he received temporary reassignment to division-level training, not permanently, just enough to share his methods with a few hand-picked riflemen from across the 4th Infantry. His lessons were simple but powerful. Improvise with precision, measure everything. Trust your instincts, but verify them with data. One of the sergeants who'd previously mocked Jack asked to borrow the scope just to examine it. Jack allowed him. The man held it up to the light, frowned, then handed it back. "This thing's ugly," he muttered. "But damn, it works." Back at camp, word spread beyond their unit. Another battalion dispatched a runner, asking if Jack could demonstrate his technique. A major from division staff appeared unannounced, requesting a written summary. It seemed no one could comprehend that a homemade scope, fabricated in the woods with scrap parts and solder, had accomplished what no regulation sniper rifle had ever achieved in that sector. It had stopped a tank. Not destroyed it with brute force, but outsmarted it. Jack didn't gloat. He wasn't built for that. He kept to himself, as always. He spent his evenings re-examining the scope, cleaning the bolt, and running his fingers along the cold steel barrel like a mechanic inspecting a car engine. He knew better than anyone. He wasn't chasing glory. He was chasing reliability. The rifle, the scope, and the shot had become one story, his story. And though he never asked for recognition, the army was now watching closely. Because in a war of machines and mass production, Jack Bingham had proven something timeless, that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't what you're issued, but what you build with your own hands. The war would continue for another 3 months. In May 1945, Nazi Germany surrendered. The guns fell silent across Europe. Cities lay in ruins. The fields in places like Champagne, Normandy, and the Ardennes were littered with rusting steel and memories soaked into the mud. For most soldiers, including Jack Bingham, there was no grand ceremony, no dramatic farewell, just orders. Orders to pack up, return home, and forget, or try to forget, what they'd witnessed. Jack went back to Kansas in the summer of that year. The town of Marshall welcomed him quietly. His parents had preserved his workshop exactly as he'd left it. The same tools, the same broken watches, a notebook still open on the table, marked in pencil, 3-second drift at 500 yards. He never spoke much about what happened overseas. When neighbors inquired, he offered a polite smile and said, "I did my part." That was sufficient. But the rifle came home with him, the Springfield M1903A4, along with the homemade scope, still scratched, still patched with wire and glue. It sat in a locked cabinet for years, untouched. In the 1950s, Jack was invited to speak at a local veterans gathering. He brought the scope and rifle, not to brag, but to demonstrate what a man could accomplish with the right motivation and the right mindset. The audience listened quietly as he told the story, not just of the shot, but of the ridicule, the failures, the perseverance. He ended with a sentence that would later be etched on a brass plaque next to his display in the Regional War Museum. It was never about the scope. It was about believing that I could make something better, even when no one else believed it with me. The Army never formally adopted Jack's design, but his story made its way into the unofficial lore of infantry marksmanship. During the Korean War and even Vietnam, instructors would occasionally tell new recruits about the Kansas boy who built his own scope and took out a tank. The details were often exaggerated, as war stories are, but the core truth remained. One soldier's willingness to think differently had made a measurable difference. In the late 1970s, a military historian researching improvised weapons from World War II tracked Jack down. They spoke for hours. Jack showed him the scope, now stored in a padded case lined with flannel. The historian took careful notes and later published a chapter in a little-known book titled "Tools of Last Resort: Ingenuity in Combat." That same year, after the war had ebbed and the echoes of gunfire had faded from the forests of Epernette, Jack Bingham made a quiet decision. He donated the Springfield M1903A4 and the handcrafted scope, the very instrument that had turned ridicule into astonishment, to the Kansas Military History Center. Today, the rifle rests in a glass case, a silent sentinel to ingenuity and courage. Above it hangs a faded photograph of Jack himself, captured years earlier. A young man with a square jaw, eyes steady and unflinching, fingers still slightly stained with the grease and oil of a mechanic who could fix more than machines. He could fix problems under pressure, recalibrate failure into success. Visitors stroll past in a slow, respectful drift, most never pausing long enough to take in the details. Yet some stop. They lean in, squint at the hand-etched crosshairs, trace the shallow scratches that mark the steel barrel and mounting ring, and in that moment, a subtle recognition strikes. This is not the story of medals gleaming in polished cases or heroes lauded in newspaper headlines. It is the story of a young mechanic who refused to let the word impossible define the boundaries of what could be achieved. Even under the most harrowing circumstances, Jack Bingham never sought legacy, and yet, by quietly defying convention and embracing his own ingenuity, he left one that endures. He never considered himself a strategist. He bore no stars upon his shoulders, did not sit at tables strewn with maps, pencils, and orders. He was a corporal, a field soldier, one of many, trained to follow directives to execute the commands of superior officers. And yet, in the snow-drenched forest near Epernette, his perspective, patience, and practical skill nudged history in ways that no planning, no high-level strategy could have foreseen. In the months following that single, defining Panzer incident, word of Jack's feat wove its way through the channels of the 4th Infantry Division. Initially, whispers traveled from soldier to soldier, half incredulous, half admiring. Gradually, reports reached the ears of officers, then found their way into after-action reviews and field evaluations. Jack's achievement was never formally enshrined in doctrine during the war itself, yet its implications could not be ignored. First, the Army recognized a profound lesson in resourcefulness. Jack had transformed broken, discarded items, a cracked microscope, fragments of enemy artillery steel, a strand of scrap wire, into a functioning tool that operated effectively under combat conditions. That realization alone reframed what was possible in the theater of war. highlighting that ingenuity often matters as much as inventory and supply chains. Second, his innovation exposed a tactical blind spot previously overlooked in sniper training. The prevailing doctrine focused on targeting personnel, enemy officers, machine gun nests, forward observers. Armored vehicles, thought impervious to small arms at long range, were largely ignored. Jack demonstrated against all assumptions that precise observation combined with tactical insight could make even a tank vulnerable. He had aimed not at armor, but at its weaknesses, leveraging knowledge, calculation, and patience. In doing so, he expanded the conceptual boundaries of what a sniper could accomplish. These lessons rippled into formal recommendations. Some after-action reviews suggested expanded sniper training, emphasizing the identification of structural vulnerabilities on mechanized vehicles. By the late 1940s, the post-war field manual would quietly include a clause: personnel should be trained to identify and exploit exposed support elements of mechanized units when conditions permit. The manual made no mention of Jack Bingham by name. Yet every word of that instruction owed its genesis to the single, disciplined shot fired by a young corporal in a snow-streaked forest. Third, Jack's improvised scope sparked internal debate on sniper doctrine. During World War II, American efforts lagged behind the precision-oriented sniper programs of the Soviets and Germans. The Soviet Union had fielded over 20,000 trained snipers by war's end. German marksmen were feared for their optical superiority and sharpshooting discipline. In contrast, the American approach was decentralized, inconsistent, and too dependent on available equipment. Jack's creation, a humble, hand-built optical device, forced officers to confront a deeper question. What if soldiers were empowered to innovate in real time at the front, rather than wait for bureaucratic solutions? The post-war decades bore out the significance of such thinking. In the 1950s, the Army began systematic investments in optical standardization and structured sniper training. By the time Vietnam's jungles demanded precision shooting, snipers were recognized as strategic assets. Rifles were improved, optics refined, and doctrine sharpened. While Jack Bingham did not single-handedly achieve these reforms, he demonstrated a principle that resonated across generations. Battlefield intelligence is not merely the collection of information. It is the ability to recognize when circumstances demand adaptation, when conventional tools and tactics are insufficient. Modern military programs still echo Jack's lessons. Soldiers are trained to identify vulnerabilities in enemy vehicles, think critically under duress, and, when necessary, create improvised solutions when standard equipment is unavailable. These lessons, embedded in curriculum and culture, did not arise from theoretical analysis alone. They trace their lineage back to a quiet young man with steady hands, a mind honed by mechanics and watchmaking, and the courage to defy convention in the heat of combat. One shot, one hand-built scope, one quiet, deliberate defiance of established doctrine. And from that act emerged a ripple effect, shaping generations of marksmen, engineers, and soldiers who came to appreciate an essential truth. Precision is not solely about the sophistication of a tool. It is also about the determination and ingenuity behind its use. In every war, history remembers names etched on monuments, generals, battles, victories, dates. Yet history is equally shaped by quieter moments, instances of creativity, judgment, and resolve. Moments that do not appear in dispatches or make headlines, but whose impact can shift outcomes far beyond the immediate. Jack Bingham's moment exemplifies this truth. It did not come as a blaze of glory. It came in stillness, in controlled observation, in the quiet certainty that the impossible could be achieved. We live in an era of precision-engineered tools, digital systems, and standardized solutions. Yet the principle that drove Jack Bingham remains profoundly relevant. Real challenges often require unconventional thinking, resourcefulness, and the courage to act independently. Breakthroughs rarely emerge by following instructions alone. They arise when someone refuses to accept limitations, when someone decides, I can build this, I can solve this. Jack's homemade scope was more than a mechanical feat. It was a declaration that ideas, persistence, and practical ingenuity are as vital as bullets or steel, that the boundary between failure and success is often the willingness to attempt, to experiment, and to endure skepticism. Consider the battlefield he faced: mud, cold, fear, and the ever-present hazard of death. In that environment, a young man armed with nothing but a broken microscope, steel from enemy shrapnel, and unshakable resolve transformed the tide of a small engagement, not by orders, but by vision and skill. His story continues to resonate today, reminding us that innovation is not confined to departments, laboratories, or hierarchies. Sometimes it is born in the hands of the determined, the observant, the resourceful, those who refuse to wait for permission. One man, one improvised lens, one bullet, one act that ripples through history decades later, challenging us all to ask, what could we accomplish if we refused to accept the limits imposed by circumstance, authority, or doubt? Jack Bingham never sought recognition. He never wrote memoirs, never demanded medals, never attempted to rewrite the rules. And yet, through a single act of ingenuity, he left a legacy far more enduring. A story of courage, creativity, and quiet defiance that still inspires. What part of Jack's journey strikes you the most? Is it the laughter he endured, the silence that followed the shot, or the unforeseen impact of his actions? Or is it the question his life leaves lingering? What would you create if you stopped waiting for permission and trusted your own hands, mind, and will? Think on that. Because somewhere, someone else may be holding their own version of a broken tool, an idea that seems absurd, or a challenge that feels impossible. And maybe, just maybe, your belief in them is the shot they have been waiting for. Thank you for watching.